Hey, you summoned a lesser maker. I know that when I first started building terrain for Mordheim, it was really difficult to figure out what to build first. Let me introduce you to Roll for Terrain. This is a challenge that I like to do. What's nice about this is every single one of these things on this list is in Mordheim. So it really narrows your field of view. And once you roll for a result, that's what you build. Some of these things are kind of obscure and take some interpretation to make a build out of it, or you could just roll again and get something that's more tangible. We're gonna roll on this together and see what we're building this week. So we rolled a graveyard. I've made graveyards before on this channel, but I've never made a dedicated video. So I think I'm going to use this opportunity to consolidate all the STLs, all the PDF templates, make a new template. I have some Lasercut files for tombstones. So if you're interested in that, it's free on my Patreon. You don't have to subscribe or anything. It's just my way of paying it forward. Mordheim is a free game. So I like to see other people make stuff and help you guys out. The first element I'm going to make is coffins. I'm going to make these out of popsicle sticks and some balsa wood. And we're going to make a bunch of these. I have a mini over here as well for scale. And we're just assembling this with super glue. I want to make a bunch of these coffins. So I'm going to whip together a quick mold. For that, I'm going to use silicone putty. If you've never made molds before, this is my recommendation for beginners because there's absolutely no risk of leaks. This putty is really great. You could always use blue stuff for something like this, but something like coffins, treasure chests, or doors in this case are things that I'm going to be using a lot of. So making a mold that will last longer, I think makes more sense in the long run. After doing that a few more times, before I knew it, I had enough coffins to fill a whole graveyard. And with the cure time of just 5 minutes, I was able to make a bunch of these faster than I would be able to 3D print them. I grabbed my Mausoleum template from my Patreon, and it has a bunch of alternative fronts so that you can make a variety of different mausoleums with this and fill a whole graveyard. So I selected the one I wanted, and I used my usual method for stonework. I cut it out of XPS foam. I stamped in a texture with some heavy pressure with a rock, and then I punched in the bricks with a brush that I crimped into a rectangle. On the Games Workshop mausoleums, that miniature has corrugated metal for the roof texture, and so I'm going to be using hacking plastic. This has that corrugated texture, and it paints up really well. So I'm going to cut a piece out and use this as the brick. to build this graveyard, we're gonna need a board. A couple weeks ago, I built this board with some foundations and do some terraforming to stick some of these coffins in. I use Great Stuff gap filler up to 3 inches expansion to do some terraforming. To start off, I just sprayed it everywhere, and I sprayed more of it than I probably would have because I want to have more to work with and cut away than having less and then having to wait longer and add more. If you heat up pipe cleaner with a lighter or heat source, it'll shrink wrap the fur and fuzzy stuff around the armature wire, and that does a really good job of simulating rope in a miniature scale, as well as adhering to paint. Wire typically doesn't really like paint, so having that polyester fiber does a good job of making sure paint sticks. We're wrapping this around the coffin to make sure this undead doesn't rise again. So this Great Stuff gap fill hardens with like an outer coat that is pretty good to paint on. Obviously, it's not the shape we want though. So I'm going to be roughing in that shape with the handsaw, and when I want something that's a little more fine detail, I'm going to grab a box knife or an X-Acto knife. Make sure that things are the way I want them. This will expose the poly filler or whatever that's in the middle, and it isn't as hard as the outside shell. But we're about to fix that issue in a few minutes. Now it's time to become a grave digger and hot glue all these caskets in. With equal parts Elmer's glue, sand, and paint, I mixed together a texture paint, and I used half black paint and half brown paint to get a really dark brown. If any of this texture falls off, or the paint chips off, which is pretty unlikely, the brown base coat that we're mixing in here is gonna be pretty good to kind of mask any of that. A lot of the polyfiller that we exposed when shaping this thing, I don't think is good enough to be subjected to a ton of miniature play. So making a really hard texture paste is important to make sure that this is a durable playing surface, and it replaces that hard coat that naturally forms while this hardens. I pushed in a bunch of resin details while this paste was hardening. And there were some things that didn't adhere and some things that did. So before I went any further, I just went ahead and hot glued all those details in. Almost 2 years ago, I got a Warcry box, and the terrain has been sitting in there for that time, not really being used. So I pulled out some of the skeletons from that kit, and I'm going to be sticking them into the ground here. Some of them I'm putting in the caskets, and most of them I'm just sticking into the ground loose. I asked my son what he thought about what I was making, and he suggested that instead of a tombstone, I make one of these a monument. One of the monuments that came to mind immediately was from Elden Ring, and it's like a cluster of swords. The centerpiece of those are like a giant sword, and I just finished using a 1/16th model for my Monster Bash last week, if you want to go check that video out. So I assembled that sword, stuck it into the ground, and I think it looks pretty good. I put a couple extra in there. So I primed all of this with a dark brown, and I'm going to be kind of painting everything with a really similar color. I mixed up a greenish tan for all the wood, and I wanted it to look like a really dead wood, except for it's like mossy. So I wanted like a greenish tone, and then I mixed up I just added a bit of black for all the stone and tombstones. And then I added a bit more light tan for all the bones. While I'm painting, I'd like to thank my Patreon members, because without them, funding these videos become difficult. Thank you so much for your support. I genuinely appreciate it. If you'd like to help support the channel, it's only $2 a month. And that works out to be like 25 cents a video. Patreon isn't your thing. I also have merch that I've designed and hand drawn myself. These are designs that I really like, and if you guys like it too, that's just kind of an added bonus. Of course, you can just watch along, check out the backlog, subscribe, like, and leave a comment. All those things do a lot to help this video reach new people. So if you like it and appreciate it, make sure you share it with others. All right, back to the video. After doing the base coat, I went in with a green wash for all the wood and a black wash for everything else. Unfortunately, it kind of went too dark with that black wash, so then again I went over everything with that light tan color, and then I did the black wash again, and so on and so forth. I never have a straight and arrow like recipe for any of these colors. I just kind of keep going till it looks good, and that seems to work usually. Overall, I'm super happy with how this thing turned out. I know it's a small section of the board, but sometimes breaking the surface on a project this big can be the hardest part. I really like how this thing turned out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.